Listen up, you primitive screwheads. It's not just a great opening, it's also a great book. Welcome to Night City, everybody, because tonight's topic is the Cyberpunk Referee's Guide, which doesn't sugarcoat the difficulty of running this setting, which is a bit of a fresh take considering the number of games that were pillow-fisted back in its day. Not Cyberpunk. It goes straight for the jugular and doesn't let go. The naked honesty gave the book a well-deserved reputation for quality, and that's a reputation that is upheld today. I'm Mr. Welch, and get your boomsticks ready because we're going to look at the Cyberpunk Referee's Guide, so hail to the king, baby. The book was written in 1994 by Mike Pondsmith and a host of other authors, just 2 years after Army of Darkness premiered. Somebody really liked Ash Williams because the title is almost a direct quote of the famous line, only reversing the "Okay, you primitive screwheads, listen up." The book is divided into 10 chapters, each one giving new tips and tricks on how to run a Cyberpunk campaign. The game at the time had a bad reputation of just being a combat simulator, and this was something that R. Talsorian was trying to fix. The first chapter was all about running long-term campaigns and was divided between Craig Sheely, Benjamin Wright, Eric Heiserer, and Spike Wynn. God, I hope I pronounced Eric's name correctly. Cyberpunk 2020 has the problem of being a game with a long-term potential that's held back greatly by the fact that it's bloody lethal. The four men give pointers for keeping a long-term campaign going, from ratcheting back the lethality for a more character-driven game, reminding characters it was okay to retreat, and talking about how to integrate the life paths of all the characters to create a fluid campaign that everyone could enjoy. There's a whole host of other tips in this chapter, but I'm not going to go over each one. That's for you to discover. Chapter 2 is more Sheely and Wright, with an additional text by Charlie Wong. The second chapter is a short reminder of what makes Cyberpunk. It talks about if you're going to play the setting, remember, first and foremost, technology is everything. Unlike a lot of games where gear is downplayed over the character's skill, in Cyberpunk it's reversed. Everybody has to have the next big piece of gear. Fashion goes out of style in less than a week. The mood is supposed to be depressing, and it's always raining and life is cheap. Artel based a large amount of their work on Blade Runner, among other sources, but they will also remind you that this is because Blade Runner is memorable. You can almost smell that movie with its unwashed masses. In Cyberpunk terms, it was as close to perfection as it got, and the closer you can get to that feel, the better. Third chapter deals with one of Cyberpunk's biggest problems, the power gamer. The game was rather easy to min-max, its mechanics being one of the weaker spots of the game. In this chapter, Wynn, Wright, Hesserer, and Wong give you tips on how to handle these players. Remember when this book came out, there was a lot of talk about how some of these suggestions were a bit harsh. If a player abused a combat rule to wipe out your super solo by abusing the system, just return the favor. Other more merciful options were to tweak the rules, or if the power gamer wasn't upsetting the balance of the game, with the example being given of the Bulletproof Medic, let it slide. Don't let one person's fun disrupt the game, but at the same time, if their fun isn't disrupting the game, don't disrupt their fun. Chapter 4 goes into the definition of the cyberpunk world and how to keep it true to the setting. Cyberpunk is the game of the underdog. The players should never be the ones on top. They should struggle in all things. The big bads will always be bigger. The players should have to worry about where their next meal comes from, and they can only dream of a full magazine for their gun. The temptation to join in with the haves and leave the ranks of the have-nots should always be there. It's not enough to keep the players down. You have to dangle the easy option in front of them for the low, low price of their soul. The next chapter covers all things combat, a major point of the game. There's a lot of tactical advice in the chapter, and it does get a little bit crunchy. It gives advice on how to use the cool stat to simulate people panic in combat rather than the smooth combat operators the game is notorious for having, despite the fact that very few characters are combat-oriented from the start. The chapter talks about basic combat suggestions like Overwatch and ambushes. It goes into great detail of how to handle different types of weapons in Cyberpunk, pointing out that pistols are far less likely to get you shot down by cops than an assault rifle, while knives will be overlooked more easily than swords or other melee weapons. Keeping the combat scale down to the party's abilities is a major aspect of running a good game. In Chapter 6, the book focuses on dealing with fleshing out your life path and giving the characters backgrounds they can do things with. It even gives the game master a plot path to deal with the characters' pasts and introduce them to people they may have forgotten about. This chapter goes into great detail on how to build up an entire storyline from just your character's past. Your contacts and love interests get fleshed out and introduce new characters that get fleshed out, and soon you have a fully realized supporting cast to pull adventures and plot hooks from as you need them. It ties heavily into running a long-term campaign, but only in much more detail. The next chapter covers the characters the game designers consider fringe, which is everybody that's not a solo for the most part. The chapter covers a lot of the other roles in some manner, though most of these characters get their own books later in the Cyberpunk line. Well, everybody except for the techie and med-techie. It gives tips on how to avoid the inherent problems with a lot of the characters because of their affiliation with certain groups or locations. A large number of the roles get a few paragraphs how to expand on them, but their book completely explodes their options, so this chapter is more of a teaser of what's to come. Then on to Chapter 8, which details the scope and merits of different campaigns, as well as suggesting new settings for the players. This goes into much more detail than previous chapters, offering suggestions on playing the uber-rich golden children, down to the combat zone thugs stabbing each other for scraps of food. It goes into great detail on keeping the players on some path of morality so they're not just gun-toting murder hobos. It gives a lot of suggestions on how to turn your campaign on their ear with just a few twists. There's tips on taking your players out of the cities and trying an eco-terrorist campaign for a change. For example, the penultimate chapter is all Mike Pondsmith giving his best advice on how to run a Cyberpunk campaign. He gives numerous suggestions in different columns, from the importance of the unbeatable foes to keeping players on the move to keep the action fresh. He's the original Cyberpunk Game Master, and he is sharing his secrets. His biggest tips include how to keep the game original and keep the players guessing. If you've got a super solo destroying everything, he gives you plenty of options on bringing them back down to earth, in pieces if necessary. The last chapter is purely rules, mainly a new combat system that is easier to run for simpler battles. There's also new rules for explosives and close combat rules, along with some martial art styles. This is the shortest of the chapter because it's almost all charts. And that wraps up Listen Up You Primitive Screwheads. It's packed with a lot more information, more than I can possibly list in a single review, and I have to leave something out for you to read, and you should read it. It gives you ideas from the masters on things that you might have never considered. Next week I'm going to take a look at Maximum Metal, the Cyberpunk vehicle game that I've mentioned multiple times in previous books, but I've never talked about before. So in the meantime, go pick up this masterpiece and read it, because there will be a test later.